you know the technology, you know the industry, you know the structure. You can sell up and down the stack like SMB enterprise. Right? Like you can run a team. Like he's not gonna hurt at all.
Yeah. It was interesting when I sent you my resume and you're asking, I was like, what are you looking for? And that's why I haven't responded back. I was like, oh, it's a real good question because it's so broad, right? Like there's security part, which I think that's where I want to go. But I realized like, well, I don't have a single certification. Like funny enough, my single certification is Windows Vista. Can you believe that? So on paper, just like, who is this guy?
Windows Vista. Oh my goodness. How is the sabbatical going?
It's going good. You know, the first month and a half was fine. You know,
detox.
just detox and unplugging, like deleting Superhuman, deleting Slack and all that stuff. But you know, now that it's been like a month and a half, it's like I'm driven to find something.
You gotten twitchy yet?
Yeah, that's exactly what's happening.
Yeah. I think the goal is you got to like push through the twitchy phase. And like when you get through the twitchy phase, right, then you're like, you know, you're there, you know. It's my win the lottery like thing is just taking my cell phone and just smashing it on the pavement as hard as I can and then walking right into an Apple store and buying another one. But like it'll just be the act of like, wow.
I would love to have just like a Motorola Razr from like,
oh, can you imagine?
Just text and phone call.
I've been looking at these devices for a while now of like the dumb phone devices. And that's the thing that really pushed me into wearing the watch more than anything else. Is to like leave the phone, but you still have a cell phone so family can get a hold of you. And I feel much better about that. Like I can, you know, have a heart attack on the side of the road and still call 911 without my phone on me full time. How long? So you a month and a half out now?
You're about 2 months now.
So, I mean, that's the what next is an interesting question though, right?
It's interesting enough. Hector and John reached out last week. Would you come back? I was like, maybe for this. I thought about it, but you know, just because everyone I've reached out to, it's like just got nothing back. And what makes me nervous is getting into, you know, like the holiday season, you know, especially with like elections and stuff like that. Like no one knows what's kind of going to happen with the market. So, but where security seems like an amazing opportunity, it's like, once we get into that IPO market again, there's the necessity for all that, right?
Security is such a strange animal to work with companies. And I've been asking this question for, I think, 4 or 5 years, you know, and predominantly the companies building the product and selling the product of how do you sell this to a company that's not buying, right? Like, because it really feels like it's a very binary divide, right? Like we're in the market for X, we need to go buy X, or we have to solve Y, right? And if they're not in the market to buy X or solve Y, like how do you go through an education cycle? Like you should have multi-factor turned on, or you should have an EDR, or you should have this thing. And I haven't found a compelling answer for that one yet. I mean, you've been on the inside of this for a while now, like selling to an organization, even from an insider standpoint of going up the stack and saying, hey, we need to have these things in place. It's not an easy hill to climb, right?
Right. Well, the obvious one is an external factor.
Yeah.
Right. But where I've found productive too is finding value to it, right? Or like a sales goal. It's like, hey, we have an RFP for a large contract. Let's get ahead of the game so we can turn it fast. That seems pretty productive.
It's outcome, right? You have to sell the outcome.
Exactly.
It's very difficult for, I think, a lot of people in IT to make that shift. We get so wrapped up in, you know, the sales speak is speeds and feeds, right? But it's like the actual technical, it doesn't really matter what it is. It's like, you know, storage or computer, you know, internet or firewall or whatever it is. It's like always like a technical conversation around it because that's how it's presented and that's how we operate. But then you go and you try to talk to a non-technical person like, hello, Mr. CFO, can I have $1 million? For what? You know, for this thing. What does this thing do? It's really awesome.
Constant cost center.
Jeez. My theory in this with security is kind of I've used the term scar tissue now a lot of when there's enough scar tissue that builds up, then people start investing in cybersecurity because they don't want to experience it again. And I don't mean it like, it's like, oh, my neighbor was just hacked, so I don't want to get hacked. Or like I was at this other company and this company got hacked, or like I'm on the board of here, we have an investment in this thing, you know, some kind of like, maybe not even first degree, but more like second degree. Like something horrible has happened. And so now let's buy these things and invest in it, make sure it doesn't happen to us.
It's interesting, you know, even from a personal side, it's like, how do I get EDR on devices.
Yeah,
parents'
right.
devices.
Right?
So you can't get a single license of like Sentinel-1 or CrowdStrike.
I figured out how to do it.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, I figured out how to do it.
All right, we'll talk about that later.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, right? Like, that divide for a lot of companies, it feels like you have to cross that like 100 to 200 employee threshold before a lot of this stuff actually becomes practical to go out and purchase and to budget against.
Is Defender okay?
It's got a lot of the market at this point. I mean, we'll see. I looked you up on LinkedIn before we did this. I was just kind of curious because we've known each other for a long time. And I want to talk about your career arc for a moment. Sorry at the beginning. Really, this is, your Windows Vista certification days, right?
Yeah.
So, Neil, you started with your title as desktop support engineer, right? But you started doing very classical like IT and help desk and end user support. And, had a couple stints, in that realm. And then really unusually, I think in the tech space, long stints companies, almost 8 years, with what became a Moby, over 5 years with video. I mean, this VideoAmp, these are long runs. So I'd love to hear more kind of like what got you into this and what those levels were where you felt like you really crossed a line and what that looked like for you.
Yeah. Where it started off was Quality IP, which was small MSP of Kent, Ohio. And I was just trying to get college credits. So I was working there as an internship, close friend, brought me under his wing. And we were basically providing support for everything from dentists to call centers, basically any company that does not have the budget for full-time IT. So that experience, I feel like, brought a lot of exposure to different types of Windows servers from 2003 to 2008, R2, all that stuff. So a slew of different firewalls, right? And I kind of just got thrown into it. And I didn't realize at the time of what I was working on because I was just being exposed to it for the first time. And, from there, I always had this drive to Los Angeles, a bunch of family out here. And once I graduated, I was like, well, I'll just throw a couple feelers out there and see what I can get. And that jump happened to a company called Internet Brands, people attend that type of software, I believe. And, just like you said, basic desktop support as servers, BlackBerry, that golden age.
Oh man, I have stories.
Yeah. And from there, it just went from desktop support to looking for just other opportunities to get more exposure. Went back to another local MSP here. Did that for about a year and then just managed to network and find a recruiter through a friend at Coney and EdTech. And that's really where I think the experience started to have long stints, as you previously mentioned. And just working my way up from there, a lot of rapid growth, I think 2 or 3 M&As during my time there from, it was like a Coney and Contier to a Moby. So a lot of work from on-prem Microsoft Exchange to Office 365 to Google Apps in the span of 5 years. So a lot of fairly big projects, which we outsourced at first. Then by the time I finished there, why are we outsourcing this when we can do it internally? To answer your question of where the biggest jump happened was you heard a lot of this, the traveling around the world, from everything from network to office builds. I mean, at a Moby, we had 10 to 12 offices, everything from Tokyo, Singapore to Tel Aviv, London, Merapi, Stat, site VPNs, all that fun stuff. Active Directory servers everywhere, trying to just build that network up with the team that we had at the time. But I think that's really where the experience jumped because of the rapid growth from, say, 200 people all the way to 1,000. And then it kind of settled off, and that's lined up at VideoAmp to kind of start back at that 80 to 100, and let's do it again.
Until you've been through that kind of growth, it's hard to explain it. But that like hair on fire, like everything is happening at the same time, it's fun. It's addictive. Once you've gone through a startup phase and that like 80 to 1,000, like just drive, it's hard to like sit idle for a long time and get back into it. And I'm going to dig into M&A, right? Because I think M&A becomes one of the first like untapped value unlocks for IT teams, right? Because now you have a very specific business objective. And that business objective is acquisition. It could be evaluation, right? Can we make this acquisition? It's evaluation, acquisition, integration, and then efficiency. And the faster you get through those steps, the more value that's driven out of that acquisition and the return to revenue. And like the first one you guys went through, it's like the first one through org. You probably have people that have been through M&A before working for the org at that point, but the org hasn't gone through M&A. And so what did you see kind of with the first one versus the second one versus the third one of that engagement and involvement and how much you were involved in that conversation of like, okay, now we've done this, we kind of know what we're doing, go out and take care of this for us.
The common pattern is the 30-60-90 plans, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, typically IT doesn't have much instruction at that point, and you start seeing, documents shared through two different systems, and it was this kind of like, oh crap moment. I mean, when do we integrate this? When do we actually migrate from one system to the other? Which system wins?
And you're talking about right now you're talking about like Google Workspace versus
Office 365, for simply like, right. Email collaboration.
Right. Basic stuff.
I feel like that's the biggest hurdle at first, at least in my experience.
What was the decision? Like just the company do the acquisition in your case? Or, what was the evaluation process of what wins?
The evaluation process was really just from a cost perspective and productivity. Right? What's going to cause the least amount of disruption and what kind of pricing we're going to get for a longer term contract that we felt comfortable with at that time. From there, it's laying the blocks seem to be, just network and office consolidation. You'd say that it's not really part of IT, but facilities was a heavy part of it. Mm-hmm. Offices, right? And that would kind of came second. So it was never really part on the engineering side until it became like an Active Directory authentication conversation. What with that, I think maybe the email and collaboration was the big hurdle at first. And I think what I've learned from the first interaction to the second was, learning from, say, third-party contractors that were doing this day in, day out, right? And then figuring out the business use case of what we needed to kind of accelerate and how fast we needed to do it second and third times.
Mm-hmm. I don't think this is one of those, like, there's no right way. It just becomes like a personality way, right? Do you do these like long, slow, migrations, or do you go like crazy and like rip the Band-Aid off? And I've been involved in enough data center migrations, for example, where it's like, we're trying to do no downtime and rolling. When I say migration, I mean like physically leaving one building and going to a different building. And I've turned into much more like, just do it, kind of person. Like, we know we're going to make this migration. We're going to spend 6 months doing this migration, or we're going to do it right now. Like just jump off the cliff and figure out how to build a plane on the way down.
I think you helped us with that from cage to cage.
Yeah, that was a fun one. You bring up third-party contractors. And this is also a really interesting dynamic. I think we start talking about like in-house IT of, being in a role where you're now transitioning into supporting the organization and helping the business function, not necessarily doing the work anymore. And I feel like that becomes a big transition for a lot of people in their IT careers and working their way up of understanding like, I don't have to physically be doing the work anymore. Like, now my value to the organization is getting the work done. And then seeing that with a contractor cycle coming in, and then also kind of this constant like push and pull around, well, I can do the work. Should I not do the work? Do we do the work? Do I fly to Singapore and install this Meraki equipment? Do I hire somebody to, like how did you find that balance?
I think the balance was due to just cost. When you're working with these third-party contractors, like, you still need someone internal to work closely with them. And when you're working with lean teams and 4 or 5 people, it's like, well, we're going to dedicate one person to this regardless, and might as well just do it.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what I found from it. It provided value by face-to-face time with those local IT personnel that were on my team, and being able to kind of build those relationships, especially when we have people from Sydney to Singapore. That's really the big driver to it was, well, we can do it ourselves and know how we did it rather than relying on just basically just remote hands. It's typically what it ended up being. Now, I know that's not always the case, but I mean, the vendors and everything, but from the experience and the kind of speed that we wanted it to happen, that seemed to be the most effective.
This also probably comes down a lot to stack too, like stack selection. If you're running local AD, right, infrastructure that has to be in an office to maintain and support local AD, and Windows desktops and print infrastructure and networking and internet and everything else is very different than if you say you're on a Google workspace with Mac, like what your touch point really is now at these offices, right? I mean, like when you were factory, you start talking about, cost. How deep did you guys get into this conversation around, staffing ratios, right? Like when I started, enterprise IT staffing ratio was around 60 to 1. So 60 people per one IT practitioner. And I don't feel like it's unusual to talk to a company right now where they're at 150 to 200 to 1. Now, the good news is there's a lot more tooling available and the Stone Age is when I was doing this, but it's a lot, right?
Yeah.
And you guys you were extremely lean. I mean, you were lean in Mobi and you were extremely lean at VideoAmp, right?
As I said, I think started around 60 to 70 to 1 and, grew to 100 to 1 and probably touched to 150 at some points. So there's that conversation of, everything works. What do we pay IT for? Everything's great. What do we pay IT for, right? It's a fine line.
Oh, jeez. Oh, it's so funny. It's so true. Like you can never win that argument, right? Like everything's working. We don't need this anymore. No, it's working because we have this. We just don't get rid of this thing that everything is dependent on to work properly. Oh, I've seen it too many times. But it's hard, right? Because then the flip of it is, and especially maybe this is scar tissue again, right? There's no institutional memory. You have a new person come in, you have a new executive that comes in that doesn't have the experience and the history of what went through this phase from A to B. And then all of a sudden, like, why do we have this stuff? We don't need this stuff anymore. Like, we're not, what'll pick on? Oh, SD-WAN. We don't need this SD-WAN box. Our network is fine. If you're like, your network is fine because you have this SD-WAN box. Please don't get rid of it. It's interesting to listen to the, talk about like, I just kind of had this internship with this MSP. And then, fast forward 15 years, I've had a career in IT, right? Like that wasn't a design. You didn't go to college to do this. This wasn't like a plan, right?
And to back up, I started my career as automotive tech 2 years. And I don't know if you knew that, but I turned wrenches at Honda for 2 years before that. So,
I mean, there's something gratifying about the physical world after you've been focused on the digital world for
still waiting to get back.
But that becomes like hobbies, right? Like you're like, I know a guy and he was in San Francisco and, content delivery, like he's really core internet engineering, content delivery. And I think he went to, I think it was Iceland. They went to Iceland and did a Jeep, like overlanding caravan deal. Okay. And he comes back from this amazing photography. Like I would absolutely want to do this. But comes back from this experience and like immediately goes out and buys a Jeep Rubicon. And like, it is like, I think he was in Soma, and he's like, got a grinding wheel and was like cutting the fenders off the Jeep to like do his own overlanding. And it seems extreme until you've been like working on a keyboard for, 15, 20 years. And you're like, oh yeah, it's satisfying to actually like grind a fender off and then put like, then go off into the wilderness for a few days.
Yeah, 100%.
I think all of us have the same fantasy, which is like, being on a deserted island with like no internet and no phones and no emails and like, climbing trees for coconuts. And then we make it about 6 weeks and we start getting to achieve. We're not back.
We had the conversation on like farming. Like,
yeah.
The beauty of just waking up and tilling soil.
That's a really basic life.
Yeah.
Well, where do you think that comes from? What do you think drives that?
I just think it's like the ebbs and flows of it, right? Just like I said, like being on a keyboard, staring at a screen. Yeah, it's productive. There's a lot of work getting done, but seeing just the physical part of it, I think, needs to be fulfilled at certain times.
It really is unrelenting, right? The push of the organization and the growth. I mean, you've been in ad tech, so obviously ad tech uses IT and tech to drive revenue. So at least the organization understands the value of IT and tech more than others per se, right? But even in that world, there's still a lot of friction with like, what do we spend money on? What do we not spend money on? And, if you're on a workspace, to me, I can't even imagine watching an organization transition off Slack at this point. I mean, it would be, just, hey, we're gonna switch off Slack to Teams. I mean, that would be a fun dialogue to have internally.
Yeah, for sure.
VideoAmp, you got carved into a pretty big transition, really, from like IT director to what I think you ended up dubbed as like enterprise technology, right? Mm-hmm. And this went from, what I would say like classical IT infrastructure work into more like organizational, integrations and workflows almost, right? How did that come about, and why you? Was it just like you raised your hand, or it was like, hey, you do this? And what was the experience of making that change and that transition inside the company? We found the topic.
I think a lot of it at first starts with, in IT, there were kind of a few basic, obvious applications, the workspace, the Slacks, the Atlassian.
Let's actually pause and talk about it for a second, right? Pretty typical tech stack for IT, right? So desktops were Mac desktops, right? Workspace, Slack, Salesforce. Walk me through the different pieces, right?
Salesforce, NetSuite, ERP, some expense software with Coupa. And I think that's when, over time, I was exposed to the finance and accounting side of the applications. Those were always managed by that department. Same thing with Salesforce, kind of sat in revenue. It kind of lived on its own, but I think what really brought it together was utilizing the power of Okta, and then something like Workday for your HRIS. And I think that's where the scalability started getting obvious of, hey, we have all these attributes in Workday for, boy, this is the source of truth for a lot of good data. And I think it was a shock at first to see how much manual work was being done in underlying applications. And when we have a lean IT team and director of IT is just the responsibility of like 10 to 15. And then you start looking at overall spend and efficiencies and just natural like correcting spend, right? And I think that's where a lot of pieces just kind of fell into my responsibility there. And I think that's where I think a technical aspect in those applications that previously wasn't unlocked became obvious and needed to be sold to, like, hey, why are we doing this way? We've always done it that way, right? But just removing error, like human error, weekly CSV uploads or what have you from certain systems. Wait a second, this is all in single source of truth. Obviously, this web becomes big when you're saying like your CRM to HRIS to IDP and which way data is flowing. But once you kind of get a few key attributes there, it controls a lot of things and unlocks a lot of efficiency in the system, all the way down to, which I think we'll probably get into, like something with RBAC models and how we shift into security.
There's a certain amount of churn that happens inside of an organization. And, hopefully that churn is relatively low. You'd say, let's just pick a number. Let's just say it's 10%. You have a 10% churn. When a company's 50, that's not, it's 5 people, right? Like the inclination to still do processes manually is pretty straightforward. When you get to 500, that's 50, and then you start talking about complexity applications. How many do you have? Are they revenue doing Salesforce? Is it Slack? Is it, there's, the touch points, because every application you put out, there's stats. It's like every application deployed in enterprise actually has 8 touch points within that application with other systems. And so you start modeling that out and you look at the graph and say, okay, we've got, 5 applications, but then they're interconnected with each other. And all of a sudden there's a lot of stuff that applies to that. And then, again, 500 versus 1,000 people. So just that like onboarding I hate offboarding, it's a term, but like the offboarding process of consistency. Well, they need access to this data in Salesforce, or this data in NetSuite, or this data here. How did you guys end up on Workday? Was that just, an extension? And I mean, this, like, Workday didn't show up because somebody decided you're going to start integrating the organization around an HRS, right? Like, it was Workday happened, and then it started getting integrated, and then it became like, oh, wait, there's this thing here, let's use it, right?
Workday happened more from the rapid growth stage and, outgrowing a PEO in that model, right? I'm not an expert at it, but typically would say like between 400 and 500. If you're crossing that threshold, it becomes more cost effective. But at the same time, it's like fine line because now you need all these internal rules, tax to benefits, things of that nature. But I think that was one of the pieces where I was exposed to it at first, but then it's, looking up the APIs and seeing what data we can grab from it enabled efficiencies directly to like again, with a lean team, you're finding every little thing you can do to remediate. But that's really kind of what drove it.
And then also, Okta existed before Workday came in, or was Okta and Workday around the same time for you guys?
Okta existed before when I first got there, and it wasn't much integration, just SAML.
Okay, let's get into it. I think this is the conversation that really triggered the like, Neil, you have to do this with me like thing here, which is, I think the frustrating thing about tech for me is like knowing what like nirvana should look like, but then never actually being able to achieve it. And just always finding these things that like hold you up, right? So we were talking about it. And the conversation we were having was, do you actually need Okta? Because, we start talking about SCIM provisioning and SAML provisioning and what supports SAML and what supports SCIM and what does,
and what you're paying for SCIM.
It's not cheap, right?
Yep.
It's very expensive, like shockingly expensive, right? But even like working through that, and you take a step back and you say, should we be doing all this in the first place, or should we just be doing, OAuth on top of Google Workspace? I mean, right? Because this was a Google environment. I mean, pros and cons with that, because also the HRS systems are getting a little more sophisticated in terms of being able to take actions and do things on these other, SaaS applications as well, right? Like maybe not as sophisticated as a full SAML integration, but like pretty good. So like, you've got a little separation from this, but like thinking back and looking at it, why not just do Google Workspace with OAuth? And just say, hey, Asana, you can only authenticate, with our Google domain, or, fill in the blank application, right?
It started off as that, but again, I think what drives it is cost for the third-party application. When you cross from, say, starter plan to premium, to enterprise, to like, you can easily say starter, local auth, premium, SAML, and enterprise provisioning, right? And it worked well for a good amount of time, but once you start onboarding 20 people a week, which we were for several months, you're trying to look for any little repetitive test. Is one, you don't want to burn out your team doing these type of things, and let alone the updating, the cross, someone's moving from team to team, changing roles. That's where we felt it became very important to have that functionality.
I talk about this a lot with people of, you said like the plans, like the starter, right? And the premier, like whatever they call these things in their Chinese menu. But it really is impressive at how much the tax is to get SAML. And usually SAML comes along with e-discovery as well. So for companies that haven't been through any sort of litigation holds yet where they need e-discovery, and then you turn around and you have to enable that, as a cost feature. I've seen this with messaging platforms where 1,000-person orgs, all of a sudden they're like, oh, we thought we were paying $8 a month for this thing. And it really is now $15 a month for this thing. And it like happens overnight. You're like, okay, go budget that. Right? So 20 people a week times probably a dozen applications in addition to physical device provisioning and everything else that's going on with that.
But it doesn't base applications, right? Once you get into each department, there's a department specific thing. Engineering probably being deeper than that. The one-offs where you kind of have to dig because you haven't added something to it in a while.
Were you able to automate all that into Okta? Or were you still finding edge cases where it was like, we can do, 90% of this, but we still have to remember to go through and do X manual tasks for this team and this department?
Or even got like 80 to 90% of it through. And conversation there was, well, we only have 10 licenses, and did it make sense to have an enterprise plan on this, right? If it was just some app that a smaller team had that value there for, right? So I think I firmly believe in that like 80, 20, 90, 10 rule where it's progress, not perfect. When you have something like an Atlassian space, it's a no-brainer. Once you start doing user access reviews, SOC 2 and stuff, I think that's where it really becomes a hot topic.
I'm curious what your experience was with this, because I find even in tech companies, IT is a support function. Like not like DevOps or, production engineer. I'm talking about like the classical like IT enterprise role. So there now becomes this like friction where it's almost like the organization needs IT to function, but at the same time, the organization is pissed off that IT exists and is slowing them down. Right. And I'm interested to hear how, as you got deeper into Workday and Okta and deploying these things, like personally, I found that if you give HR the ability to go provision people themselves and do their own onboarding and say, like, they don't have to talk to you to like roll some, like, hey, we're hiring 20 people, like you don't need to talk to anybody. It like seems to tamp down that like IT rage that comes out of people. Right.
Yeah. Well, I think, again, it's a value add for now 2 teams, right? When you're doing onboarding, say every Monday, and it becomes very repetitive for recruiters to follow, like, hey, did this person get their laptop shipped? Did this person get their email activated? Those type of questions. You get bored of having those things. It drives just adding to the initial function. It's like, you start with SAML, then we got to provisioning, basic user accounts, just authentication, right? Authorization, but it's kind of just building blocks there to the point where, just like you said, bring in a new hire, or once they start date, automatically have these jobs that and the workflows that trigger, like, hey, this is going to contact our provider to ship a laptop, have them enter their address in the Workday, we push it to that, and just a cascading effect of these pieces to day one.
Did you notice a shift as that was rolled out more? Like interactions with HR, with recruiting, with marketing, engineering teams. Did you notice a shift in your interactions with them as you got deeper down into these automations?
Yeah, it was definitely a positive shift, just because it allowed people to work on other things. Yes, there was still a verification and check that we had in place, but again, I think the beauty was where I really felt like we needed to lean over again is the auditing, because it's this constant back and forth, hunting through logs, like who did this, when did this happen, when. If you can point to a single issue or ticket in Jira, you have all these timestamps. It's like, okay, well, here's everything automated via APIs, and here's the underlying systems that this into.
Was SOC 2 a customer acquisition push? Was it a growth push? Was it a pre-IPO push? Like, what pushed the SOC 2 conversation?
Push the SOC 2 conversation was a requirement from a partner deal. It's working with large companies and what they want to see from our side.
So it wasn't just SOC 2 then. I mean, partner deals, probably a whole bunch of stuff gets pushed down, right? We talk about security at the beginning of being this, let's do this before we get to this point in the sales cycle, right? Like, I don't feel like anybody wakes up one morning and goes, oh, we want to be SOC 2 compliant, right? And we're ISO 27001 or maybe you're in an industry where you have to have CMMC or you need to be team hand, these different things, but like it adds a lot of overhead to you guys. I mean, like, your annual process of audit with SOC 2, it's like, hey, it's SOC 2 time coming around, right? Like,
yeah, well, SOC 2 type 1, it's like that was fun at first because, just a third-party audit that had got us ready for it. So we really did a readiness before we got to it. So that wasn't too difficult. I think it's once you get into type 2, continuous, is where it's like, we really got to be on top of this.
Well, because now you've also designated controls that you have to adhere to basically till the end of maternity, right? And that gives you a certain amount of flexibility as well once you've designated those controls. Because like to go and unwind a control, requires some effort. This like always drives this point of like shadow IT, right? Like people are like, what's shadow IT? And I find like shadow IT being this like, part of it's just like we don't want to deal with our IT team because we don't want to deal with them, right? So we can just go and fire up NetSuite and we can be in charge of it, right? Or we can go do this tool, we can be in charge of it, right? So like all these applications show up. But it's hard because, like if you're SOC 2 compliant and somebody goes and fires up some application that has data in it that IT isn't involved with, right? Now you've got like this like enforcer function that you have to maintain of being like the like walk around and be like, I know you've got that application running. We got to like either do X, Y, and Z or it's got to go, like that creates conflict too, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that at least one control is the procurement process, who has the ability to purchase software. But to your point, there's anything with like social logins or what have you, with trial accounts and things like that. That's always a fun one too. What I found to be really valuable was overall these like SaaS management software to help mitigate it, detecting social logins, be it Google or someone adding a tile in Okta for something. It helps become that watchtower.
Okay, so now this becomes like the soft skills, right? So like, because it's like it's an enabler function, right? You're supposed to enable business to function. So now somebody's added tile to Okta, right? Like, what's the right way and what's the wrong way to deal with it at that point? Like when that fires off.
Interesting questions. I think it's really like a case by case basis. Sometimes you see applications that are already in your stack. It's like, well, why is this happening? But I think a lot of it is from an awareness of, hey, what is our software catalog? And it starts there. But to the other side of that, when you see something pop up like Sun, I want to use Jira and Atlassian, and every department uses it. It's like, what is this for? Right? But it was really, a lot of it was kind of like whack-a-mole from that point, right? And I think this is kind of where we probably left off on some conversations of something like that to really control that, because it's something we wanted to automate.
That's an interesting point, right? Go out and get an SWG and a CASB just to mitigate your manual process around shadow IT functions. And there's a lot of SASE applications that are out in the market now that's part of their whole thing. It's like, hey, we're going to help you figure out your shadow IT. How do you think about this? Or maybe you haven't thought about it, but I'll ask you now. In terms of organization sizes, like 50 versus 100 versus 200. I mean, I don't know what the right numbers are, right? But I'm saying 50, 100, 200, 500, 1,000, 2,000. Like, what's that evolution really be in like maturity? Like, oh, we deployed Okta at this size, but we really should have done it at this size, or it should have been this other size instead. Like Workday, we got our, we switched to our PEO at this size, but after we did it, maybe we should have waited. We should have done it sooner. Like, how would you think about that in terms of growth, like these checkpoints?
It always starts around 100. And I say that because that's typically when full-time IT comes in play, where I'm sure you have your basic kind of desktop support coming in, but you want to mature the stack from an IT perspective, where it's like, well, we have Okta, but this is doing SAML, this is doing double auth because it's going through Google Workspace and then back to Okta, and it's like, why are these things like this, right? So I think that's in my opinion, that's the primary piece, the IDP, Workday coming much later from that at HRIS. But I know there's products like the Rippling where it's kind of paired together to try to automate that from the beginning. I love that idea now, but I think it was just kind of this inflection point of going from, say, Active Directory or LDAP over to it.
As you took over more of like the security estate, we talk about like the implications of SOC and audit, these different things. I mean, I guess we could talk about RBAC and ABAC at this point. We could also talk about IDP. We could talk about MFA. What do you think would be the most interesting to kind of dig into it?
Seeing IDP and MFA.
Okay.
Because like once you have the IDP in place, that kind of gives you your foundation. It's like, oh, these things are sound, and really becomes apparent once you do that initial audit or assessment right of like, oh, I've shut off this person's Okta, so I know these underlying applications. So whether you disabled the account for whatever app underneath it, as long as you're enforcing SSO on those applications, that checks the box. And once you get into the RBAC and ABAC, again, kind of the horizontal movement within an organization, or in this case, someone's been at a company for 5 to 6 years, they just get permission to everything, right? How do you back that up?
Very delicately, right? Very delicately. I mean, like MFA, like real MFA for me is like the number one no-brainer thing that a company should implement as soon as possible. We can argue about like all the other acronyms. We can argue about EDR and when you do it, or like, offensive versus defensive security postures. I am shocked like how complicated it is for companies to actually implement MFA and roll MFA out to their users. Like it's like both from not even a cost, but like just a resistance, like the inertia to it of like, let's go do this.
it surprised me as well. And, when I found me, the most effective way was find the application that someone else wants to roll out, like a Workday. And if it has PII in it, like, oh, everyone has to log into this. Here's your chance to enroll everyone into it, right? If you pick a Salesforce or something, it becomes a little difficult. Obviously, on IT and DevOps and engineering sides, a lot of these, it's a different crowd, so it's easier to get them on board. But when there are those aspects, it's like, hey, we're rolling on board, and actually it's like, oh, just turn this feature on, for this, and kind of package it in there. And then from there, rinse and repeat the other apps.
I love YubiKeys. I love hardware keys. It adds a certain, I mean, I don't want to say like friction, but like it adds a layer, right? Now you have to have a physical device. I mean, you have to ship a physical device out to a person when they're onboarding. It has to get there at the right time. It has to go through an enrollment process. They have to have it. They have to plug it in, and they have to do something with it, right?
Which users should have it?
I mean, why not all, right? So like rolling that out to an org when it starts and people are coming into the company, just like, this is the way we do it, much different from just going back in time and saying, okay, now we're going to roll this thing out. Now you've got to use this thing. Did you have problems with that when you saw it with Workday?
Not really, because I think it just got to that point where the awareness, security awareness training, another thing to add to the list. Like it works, right? Because no one wants to be that person that creates risk for. And if you kind of create that fear factor, which is maybe not fear factor, right? But you know what I'm saying. It's like, you don't want to be that guy.
Nobody wants to be that guy. Nobody wants to be that guy. But I mean, so this is like, okay, security awareness training has become a required like element. Like you have to have it. It's just one of those things. Like if you go through any insurance process, like are you running SAT, right? But I have such mixed feelings with SAT because what's happening to take advantage of a person are so sophisticated. Should I just accept SAT for what it is, and it's just that we have to do it, and like casual, training is better than no training, just so there's awareness. But like I've seen some really sophisticated people like in the industry get phished, and they know what they're doing. Like how, is SAT like what's what I'm looking for, right? Like is SAT a distraction prop for security for a modern enterprise at this point?
I would say yes and no, but I think it's a good distraction because we ended up creating a culture where the simulated phishing, Slack general chat got pretty active during these times. Like no one wanted to, there were the constant questions. It's like, well, I accidentally opened this link. Like, did I fail? So it's like in my mind, it's like it's working. But to your point, they are getting more and more sophisticated. Where it's just like, what other controls you're going to put into place for it? Secure mail gateways, right? But just keeps the security pieces, just keeps building and building and growing.
A lot of the, identify, detect, protect, respond, react, like these like frameworks around cybersecurity. I think anybody that does this full time as a practitioner, it feels like you're finding something that's an eventuality to a certain point, right? Like it's just a matter of time before something bad happens. This is like I think the hardest part around selling, when I say selling, like convincing budget allocation for cybersecurity of that organization, because there's no guarantees with it, right? Like I look at it in terms of, can you block as much as you can block just because you have basic stuff in place, right? You've got training with people, general awareness, and you've got some tool. But then it becomes more like when something does happen, how quickly can you respond to it? Or do you know that something bad's happened and you can, limit your damage with it almost, right? I haven't really figured out a good way to like verbalize that or explain that, and how do you sell this to somebody that's not buying it, right? Because, you need an EDR, right? Like EDRs are good, but like what's the value in an EDR if you've never run an EDR, experienced an issue with your desktops before? Right? Like you guys ended up with an EDR because you had a SOC control that pushed the EDR. Was it a SOC control or was it a partner control?
Combination of both. It probably started with initial third-party audit. That's how it was building blocks. Security acronyms too. That keeps and the added X. But from my side, it's like if something were to happen, it's a negligence, right? Mm-hmm. I think that's the fine line. Who wants to be responsible if something happens? And once you start having that conversation, it those people pretty quick, things become necessary in the budget.
I think the line that you actually used was, we have a require, what was the line? I'll never forget it. It was something along the lines of like, I wanted the exact phrasing, but how do we ensure that corporate owned data or client data is not on non-corporate owned equipment? I remember this coming across as like one of these first, like, here's a revenue requirement in order to go out and get revenue, which then became this like technical requirement instantaneously. And now let's go out and figure out how to solve this for the organization, right? And it became this like laundry list of like, do we do this? Do we do this? Do we do this third thing? Like, what else can we shove into here? Because now is a good time to get it as well. Like, how, I mean, you were on the inside of that conversation, which became this revenue driver, which then drove a lot of changes for the organization. And I think positive. I mean, this isn't like a bad thing of like, let's go out and spend money and garbage or get nothing or just because we feel like spending money. But I've always reflected on that moment around like, you know, here it is. Like, here's like the secret. Like, you know, is this the secret unlock? Was that the secret unlock for you?
There's definitely a big part of it. It's like, again, that was the revenue driver. It's like when you can attach something to it, it's like, hey, if we don't do this, you know, we lose this partnership or, you know, data flow or what have you, right? And that's really where, just back to the intro, and I know you went through tons of different solutions for us, but I think, you know, you start off small. It's like, it was really levels of how much can we control and enforce this. You can easily say like, hey, we have our MDM and we're going to block these app names for us. Like, yeah, good, something, but is it going to really stop someone from going through this, right? Pop them in the full browser, right? You know, and have really smart engineers. Like, there's a way that they'll find a way.
Nature finds a way. Engineers find a way.
But interestingly enough, it's like, you know, with that, it got to an extent too of, I think it ended up getting into like DLP, right? Mm-hmm. And they're like, well, you have to have a DLP. You know, like I push back to the others, like, do you want us to be able to do our jobs? And where does that line, like, you know, there's a give and take there, right? And there's a risk tolerance that you need to be mindful of.
Around that point also becomes this big shift into like BYOD, right? Like, are you allowed to use your own laptop or use your own phone or use your own this anymore? That's a pretty big shift in terms of, you know, going from enablement to like restriction also for a company, you know, and I've seen a lot of organizations where that happens, and then IT gets this role of like the boogeyman. Like all of a sudden you're like Darth Vader of like just saying no, and like my job is to say no, and you hate me because all I'm telling you is no all the time. How do you manage that when you're making these? I mean, not everybody understands like your salesperson, your average like ranking. I'm not saying sales like as a negative. This is marketing, it's everything, right? Like your accountant is looking at like they have to do their job. Right? They have a job to do. And you say, no, you can't do X, Y, and Z anymore because this other thing is now dictated that you can't do that thing anymore and you have to do your job differently. I mean, it's not a great conversation to have.
No, it's definitely tough. And I think that's where a lot of cross-collaboration, like discovery of how people are doing things. And, you know, I think that's also what then unlocks areas where like, hey, we can do this more efficiently and help you move like repetitive tasks too. So it's kind of, it became this like value add where it's like, yes, this is troublesome at first, but I think we can kind of shift this to both of our benefits.
You elevated to a role where now you were running teams. How are you going out and finding, recruiting, identifying talent, and then, you know, doing development, you know, like, and this is part of it's your career track, right? Like, hey, you start with desktop support. Not a lot of people are building PCs anymore, right? Like that, like there's like people aren't building networks in their houses. Like there's a very different.
Everyone doesn't have an Ubiquity stack or something.
No, I mean, even Ubiquity, right? Like how many people are consoling into it at this point, you know? Like it's a very different skills, you know, like the skills gap has changed a lot. You know, with now it's, I mean, a lot of times it's good, but like trying to explain that things aren't actually magic and you can't just walk into an office and like have everything work, you know, hiring into this space is different.
You know, I think there were a lot of, there's a lot of key indicators in my opinion. If you see experience with an Okta and a slew of various apps, once you start having like, I would say like in 15 to 30 minutes, you can tell if someone understands the capabilities. Definitely a lot of conversations too, where you talk about what's your experience about that? It's like, well, it's like, added this app and SAML and, follow the guides and everything. But when you start having that conversation and triggering like, well, it can go this way or we can do it this way is where I found value and success with people on the team. But I think to the depth of that too is like, there's still that underlying, it's called like computer skills, like understanding, networking, and I think a lot of it just comes from experience, right? It's tough to cover all those areas, but at least in my experience, like if I hadn't gone out and set up, Meraki networks, multiple offices, have it become like a rinse and repeat, that I feel like I'd be struggling in certain areas.
That's a pretty big skills gap because you talk about an MSP. An MSP is supporting organizations that are too small typically to have IT teams, probably not running Okta if you're not running your own IT team, right? So going the MSP route of saying that like generalized customer service experience, IT experience, it's going to get you experience with an end user. It's going to get you experience with desktops. It's going to get you experience with networks to a certain degree. Probably lots of different variety of like enterprise gear at different sizes, right? Mm-hmm. Probably not deploying really like high-end enterprise Palo Altos if you're working for an MSP.
Support ASs.
Oh my goodness. It's the dark arts of VPN configuration with ASs.
Watch
guards. I have on my desk. I have on my bookshelf at home. I have all the firewalls. I have like books of firewalls. Like little ones like net screens and it's little 505E picks. But like there's a transition, right? There's a transition between like I know how to build a network and I know how to like take care of a desktop, maintain a user, and do Active Directory or do basically like that basic small authentication into the enterprise realm. And, if somebody has a lot of experience in that MSP space, how do they get the opportunity to then move into that enterprise space? Because they haven't touched Okta, they haven't touched Workday. All these things like they wouldn't have seen. It's not, it's not in the sphere of experience.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it was, I want to say it's like Okta's like newer too, so it's you kind of had to, let me backtrack on that too. I'm trying to think back of how I got involved into the Okta world, and when I think back to it, it was, another IDP. I don't even remember if it was like OneLog or Ping Identity or something like that, but it was the shift from, hey, we don't want to use Active Directory and LDAP and those type of functions to satisfy authentication. And at first it was very simple. It started with SAML and it took care of those pieces. I think Okta has an LDAP connector into it so you can get our network devices into it. And it just kind of grew from there. It's an interesting question. I don't know how to answer that.
Right. This is...
It just kind of happened.
Right. But like, how do you, this is like, I think about this a lot. I actually think about this a lot. I think about two things a lot. I think about, is there a way to help, I don't want to say it like as a derogatory, but, like rank and file IT. And this can be all the way up in like VP levels. That transition into like, how do you talk to your CFO in a way that's actually productive? Like what does the CRO actually care about that they're going to, when you have a conversation with them, like you both get what you want, right? Like CRO isn't going to care at all about an EDR. And they will, but like they care about it in different terminology, right? They care about it in terms of like, hey, if we have an incident and it's public because we have to disclose it, like it's going to affect your ability to go out and close deals with customers because now they're going to have to associate with us with a different risk profile. So how do we figure out what our appropriate level of, you have to use this annoying two-factor authentication that we've selected, but that's actually good for you because then you don't have to worry about like, selling into a hostile sales cycle. If you haven't been on the receiving end of one of these events yet, like ransomware, like you don't really understand what that's like digging out of these holes.
It's interesting because you're always, when you're looking at that budget, right, it's like something that keeps growing. It's like, what are we defending against, right? And I think that's the hard thing.
What value are we getting out of this money?
Right, exactly, which is it's a very hard conversation. Like listen to one of the other podcasts, like the ROI on security. It's like, it's probably not a good metric to use, right?
I don't think so. But I don't know, right?
Right.
How do you put an ROI on cybersecurity? Maybe some people do it because, if you've got runaway insurance premiums and you can deploy tooling that then drive down your insurance premiums or make you actually insurable, like that's a positive ROI on cybersecurity, right? Like, so some people have that event. You've talked about it in the sense of like, we had to go out and do certain things in order to get revenue. There's an attached ROI on cybersecurity, right? Like, in order to get $1, we had to go spend, 50 cents, like, well, whatever the thing was. Probably way less than that, which is what's scary about it.
I think it all also goes down that track of, hey, we have a lean team internally. It's like, if we want to be on top of our security and we're looking at 24/7 coverage, well, how many employees is that? And now you get that number.
7 per shift.
Yeah. Once you get into that number, it's like, oh, well, we can outsource this, put a big name on it, and have much more coverage and comfort for insanity for both my team and the company. So we get a win-win situation in that aspect.
I find friction with this also, right? Because I think there's a lot of inherent value of selectively outsourcing, right? Leveraging a service provider that has expertise in that domain. Not like, let's go out and hire a $300 or $400 an hour consultant, but actually, here's an organization that has 500 people. All they do is this thing, so they can do it more efficiently. And we can do it. Like, I'm a fan of that type of outsourcing. Like, can we displace all the annoying stuff that we don't want to deal with day to day to somebody else, and then they have to deal with it and then filter it and give it to us, right? But I think the other half of it that I've seen a lot, it's when something bad happens, who gets fired, part of the conversation that I think is still not discussed a lot. It's like this weird, like, unsaid thing. I was having a conversation with the director of security for a company, small team, 1,000+ employees. So, big org. The cyber team is like 3 or 4 people, dedicated to this function. And the conversation was basically, I am well paid to be fired. To really kind of shorten it to a really kind of brief point, was like, I'm well paid to be fired. And no, I can't get the budget I need to do the stuff I want. And the next person will get the budget that I was trying to get in order to do these other things. So in the meantime, I'm well paid to be fired. It's pretty depressing.
Oh, 100%. I think that's where it's like transference, right?
Mm-hmm.
Becomes into play. And at least from all our discussions, it's always been more cost effective to do that. At the end of the day, it was a revenue requirement. So it's like, no matter what, we're going to have to do this. Which way are we going to?
If it wasn't a revenue requirement, do you think you would have ended up with half of the staff that you ended up with?
I would say probably over half. There were just a lot of efficiencies that it brought, right? Because I think where visibility, I think areas where, say, an Okta, where they only hold the logs for 6 months or 12 months, or along those lines, and if we're given this third-party audit, it says, say, took SOC 2 out of it, but I'm sure whatever security questionnaires that would come through, they're still going to require some sort of evidence for it.
But that's still revenue connected, right? So
Yeah, right. I think the basic ones, when I say basic, the MFA, the EDR, it's like we really had to drive those internally. And stuff with small teams, it's like, we're on your side to sell this, right?
Right. What's your executive support above you, and is somebody actually helping drive that at the right level? Now we call it UEM for some reason, but MDM, mobile device management, unified endpoint management, whatever, right? We have a tool that now can configure and manage our fleet of devices. And you can do a lot of other stuff with it, but just at a basic level, right? Like we can push software to it, and we can deactivate it if necessary. If you want to run a lean team, this is essential stuff, right? You have to have it. I've seen pushback from organizations that were in the process of rolling out MDM and UEM platforms, where people have literally said that they thought it was like spyware being pushed by corporate IT, so that way they could be monitored, right?
I still think that.
What's so funny to me about this whole conversation is nobody has the time or cares. Maybe, out of 1,000 people, I'm sure somebody's done something bad, right? But like the average IT person doesn't have the time to care to
Right.
That's a good point, right? The amount of trust that comes out of it, it's a very, I don't know, it's primitive for most companies. Most companies still look at IT in a very primitive function, this janitorial function. And you say, okay, you have access to everything. Maybe you've got prop or role-based access controls in different platforms now, and you've moved into different systems, and you can limit access to data if you've turned that on. But somebody with administrative access is making those decisions to turn on those features in order to limit access to people, right? That creates a certain amount of conflict and friction for companies.
100%. And just back to the MDM, I think where it really became apparent was when during that few months of hiring 20 people a week. So you have the hiring managers asking, like, oh, is my new hire going to be able to be productive within this week or 3 days or today? If you take the software side of it, sure, you have your SaaS apps, and that's what we cover in the Okta part, but probably more apparent in like developer productivity, right? What little tools do they need to spin up an environment and things like that? And I think that's really where the importance of it comes into play.
Do you think that's about communicating the value of the system and then getting stakeholder buy-in? Or is it, leverage those stakeholders to then communicate, to go out and acquire the tool that gets the value to the stakeholder? Does that make sense? Like in terms of like, are you proactively going out to stakeholders and saying, hey, it takes us on average 4 days to get a laptop ready for your developer. I'd like to make that 1 day. Is that interesting to you? Or is it the other side where you like waiting, somebody screaming in the hallway of like, they can't get their 10 developers working. You're like, okay, I can solve this, but we need some budget.
I think it depends on where you are in that growth and the point of, let's say, like tooling maturity, right? I think when I first started at VideoAmp, we were getting laptops delivered to the office. We would open it up, someone would install the software on it, just not scalable. So the initial pain is to just be removed from the IT team. But then when we don't have a knowledge of what exactly they're working on or what tools they need because it's localized to whatever team or department, then that's where this kind of value add starts to come into play.
That's also a big difference between saying like, hey, here's your laptop, now do anything you want with it, into like, now here's your laptop, you can't do everything you want with it, but you can do some stuff with it, right? Like that's also part of that, shift in, let's say, corporate policy or like risk profiles, right? I mean, you said 100 people earlier. I find like crossing the 100 person is a really good first Rubicon in terms of like, it's efficient for you to go out and acquire an IDP, or it's efficient to go out and, bring an EDR into play, right? Like the cost per user at the 100 line is reasonable. Like you've crossed, MDM at 100 device, like it's reasonable, right? Like it's a reasonable overhead. I've been toying with this idea of like classifying and cataloging companies more of like, have you crossed into the enterprise license of Google Workspace or Office 365 yet? Right. No, but tell me if I'm crazy about this, right? Like, cause there's the small business plans, which force you, you 299 is your limit, right? Or 300, right? And 300 people, you get forced into E3 license, or you get forced into email gateways, especially with Workspace. If you want journaling, you need API access. You only get that with the enterprise package. So if you've gotten to the maturity level where you need to have this thing put into place, you have to go to an enterprise license. So maybe that happens to you at 200 or 250, but like, I'm starting to put that more in like that, like, okay, we've crossed over. Like the company is now like in a maturity line of like, it's not a small business anymore. This is like like we've now an SME partner, we're defining SMB up to 1,000 people. Like I don't really consider it 1,000 people. Look, there's some that are like revenue. I do love Gartner. I'm talking about Gartner nonstop. Gartner's my friend. So is Forrester. But you know what I mean? Like it's, that shift between like the SMB mentality of an organization. Like no SMB has, a GRC function. Like you don't talk about governance and risk management and compliance if you're an SMB. Like what SMB in the world cares about GRC, right? The only people that care about GRC are the ones that are big enough that they're being forced to care about GRC, right? And I don't think when you cross 1,000 people, all of a sudden you're big, now you're like SME and you should care about GRC. It happens way earlier for companies depending on what they're doing.
And I think it also becomes important to say, do we just want to check the box, or do we want to, bring value to this? There's that piece too, right?
People always talk trash about checking boxes. I don't know, like maybe it's okay to check a box, like EDR, right? EDR for a lot of people is a checkbox. SAT is a checkbox, right? Like we have to go out now. I'm not advocating like when you have the ability to check that box to go buy garbage, like you should leverage that, right? But like, if you're sitting in your, now we send at your home or Starbucks or whatever it is, but like an organization comes and says, hey, our insurance isn't going to renew us unless we have security awareness training, or we have an EDR, or we have an email gateway in place. Like, we have to go get these things. Is that so terrible that somebody's forcing you to check a box to go get this stuff that's actually good for the company in the first place?
Not at all. I mean, it's really what starts the conversation 90% of the time, in my opinion.
I mean, you had a similar experience. You went to email gateway, impersonation management, right? Security awareness training came along with that. EDR came pretty quickly after that.
Workspace Enterprise happens because of that.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, was Okta already in place at that point, or was it like Okta just happened, around that same time?
Okta was already in place, but basic functionality.
Right. But so then now you've crossed over to Google Enterprise. So now you've got SAML support within Okta. So you start configuring, SAML between Okta and Google Workspace, and you turn around and you say, oh, shoot, we should put SAML on everything we're running, right?
Well, back to the Google Workspace, like, if you've ever thought about it this way, I think this is a little details of just how I've seen others handle it. Because, say you have someone leave the company, teach delete their mailbox. Typically, but if someone wants to access it for X amount of months, we need this to forward. I think that's where cost conversation becomes into play, because if we keep this active mailbox, now we're just ballooning our costs, right? But if you get into the enterprise, like, well, we can archive it for, a few bucks a month or whatever it is. And I think that was the driver. Obviously, there's other ways you can do it that I never recommend, like just exporting. But that's what happened in the initial days. Like, oh, well, let's export the mailbox. We have PST. We'll throw it into this and archive it.
Inbox format with Thunderbird. Now you Thunderbird.
Well, there you go.
We got to roll Thunderbird. I understand how this happens and why people believe, like, let's keep their mailbox or let's forward their email. Like, I get it. I know where it comes from. I don't know, like, where do you fall on this line? Like, keeping email around and forwarding email and like, oh, we need to be able to read, go through and read all their, I mean, like, have you seen cases where, like, oh, we found something that we needed to know because this project would have dropped the ball? Like, what's the right way to offboard?
In my opinion, we have found things, I would say, more on the sales side, accounting and finance. Engineering, probably not as much, but what I've found to work is a 30 to 60 day where we forward the mailbox. After that, here, we archive it. And I still haven't figured this out with, say, like Google Drive or OneDrive. Over time, things just start getting filtered up to the chain where you end up with some executive with a huge amount of files, right? And it's like, how do you get around that? And I think a lot of it is really labeling, classification. Is this document important? And being able to determine that. A lot of work behind it, but I think cleansing in that aspect is very important, because at least in my long stints at the past two companies, it happens eventually, right? Things kind of just filter the chain.
I kind of want to disable file sharing on an individual basis. Like, if you're in your personal drive or your personal, or whether it's a Google Drive or OneDrive, right? You cannot share a file with another person inside of the organization out of your personal drive, because then it forces you to put things into shared drives where they should live. And then it's not like you've got this thing of like, because I mean, that's always a problem, right? Like, now you have to, like, okay, we're gonna copy all your data out of this drive or give it access to this drive to another person, and then they're like gonna randomly like float through, and doing an archaeological dig through somebody's email of like looking for things,
and determining, is there sensitive data that probably shouldn't be shared in the team drive. So there's that aspect to it too.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so is there sensitive data that shouldn't be shared in the team drive, right? I immediately go to HR and accounting with those things, right? I mean, you have intellectual property that gets filtered into sales and marketing orgs as well, that maybe you want to be protective of, but that becomes an interesting dynamic as well of like sharing versus not sharing, what is not, like salesperson at this point predominantly uses their cell phones. I think the biggest argument I make with companies of trying to get them into a unified phone system is like, what's the ownership of your accounts when that cell phone number, leaves? And are you driving interactions off of a cell phone number or not? And do you have the ability to talk to your customers, right? Like what happens there? And I've seen some bad things happen and drive change. But usually it's like, can we avoid the bad thing first? Like, how do we help you just avoid the bad thing?
Yeah, the mobile phones is it's a tough topic.
I made a note here, bets, right? It's been a tough topic since BlackBerry, right? Because then it was a status thing inside the company. Like, who had the BlackBerry? Did you have the BlackBerry? Did you have the BlackBerry with your email on it? Like, were you important enough that you had the BlackBerry? That was awesome, though. That worked great.
Yeah. No one ever wanted to carry around two phones, right? No one ever wants to. I don't mind it because I can put one aside when I need to, right?
I don't think you actually ever crossed over into doing eSIM with dual numbers on cell phones for people. We were doing a corporate number as well as a personal number themselves.
We did it in that aspect. It was more of a central or what have you type deal for it.
Yeah. The thing I've always enjoyed about this is there's no right answer, right? Like there's like some things you get into and you have already made a decision. You just don't realize the decision you made and like the implication of the decision. It's like, oh, we decided we're going to use Google Workspace, right? Like, well, you've made a whole slew of decisions just by that one decision, right? Like a lot of stuff has already been decided for you, which, includes like, you're probably going to run Slack and not, chat and meet spaces, right? I have yet to see a finance department successfully extract Slack from an organization yet by saying they can do, spaces for free.
Yeah, I mean it's like that goes back to the Google Workspace versus Microsoft Office. Like, well, how many companies are out there? You can answer this question, I'm sure. How many companies have Google Workspace but have Slack, but have Zoom, but have
At every Google Workspace organization that I've come across is usually an engineering internet company, and they all have Slack. And now what I have seen is organizations that were dominant Zoom, so Zoom Meet, where they're pulling back from Zoom Meet and going into Google Meet. Now, the revenue org might stay at Zoom because they're using a tool like Gong or Chorus or, whatever that has native integration with Zoom. So they stick with Zoom but you go from, multi-thousand seats of Zoom for the entire org into just, we're now Google Meet. So I've seen that change. That one was really surprising. I didn't expect, the first time I saw that, I didn't think that was actually going to happen. And it happened. But now that same organization is Slack and not Spaces. So if I see that change happen, I think that'll be really impressive. Different with Microsoft because everybody runs Teams. If you're on 365, if you had Slack and 365, I think at this point Slack's like, I can't think of a single place that still kept Slack.
Right. I think with like the Zoomverse Google Meet piece, I think what's important is the office footprint, the in-person footprint too. It's much tougher to manage, at least when I last looked at it, it was much tougher to manage a Google Meet with, say, like 50 different conference rooms.
Mm-hmm.
Talking about all hands and getting a Crestron programmed for Google Meet and all that beautiful stuff, webinars and what have you. But what I found was a nice balance. It's kind of what you said with revenue, but I always like to call it like a licensed lasso management for Zoom. Oh, you haven't had a meeting over an hour. Do you need a pro license for it? And we managed to automate some of those features where, Slack bot ping people after X amount of time, ask them if they need the license. And when you educate your users, it's like a cost savings solution, pretty open to it. It worked surprisingly well.
I actually think that might be a feature, not a bug, right? Like I've actually joked about like I want to switch off a pro license and go back into the free license of Zoom Meet just so I can't have a meeting more than 40 minutes.
There you go.
Can you imagine? Like you're just sitting there and all of a sudden you get the countdown timer, like, oh, you're done. Like, I mean, how wonderful would that be?
Yeah.
The Crestron, I mean, we haven't even talked about a lot of this stuff, right? Like that's another really good example of like you've made a decision without realizing you've made a decision and what that decision actually is, right? Microsoft, look, I was a professional Microsoft hater for a long time, right? Like I started with NT40 MCSE. I mean, want to really get back into it. Controlling the team's experience across their devices gives them such a leg up when you start talking about conference room management. And it seems like such a benign thing until you actually are like, hey, we've got 15 conference rooms and 7 different offices that we have to have working devices in. Like, and then you kind of turn around and
Maybe dedicated people to support it.
yeah. So then what do you do at that point? You just go back and just say, hey, we're not running this anymore. We're running something else because this doesn't work.
A lot of it ended up being like, how do we manage this remotely? Whether that be a remote PDU, to a basic, to a basic aspect to, being able to, remote into something and troubleshoot. Because again, it's like, it becomes a tough conversation when, say there's like a board meeting somewhere and, you're tied up in something else and the room's not working. Like,
Kind of important.
exactly. It's like, it's a lot of visibility into, it's like why is this not staffed? And sometimes it's a good conversation to have, but other times it's like, you don't have to worry about that.
We started off, we touched on this briefly, like, what's next? I mean, I don't want to call it like a linear career progression, but, I mean, most people outsiders would look at this and say, okay, desktop support, systems engineering, IT management, organizational input, M&A, right? Like that, it feels like logical in terms of progression. And you've mentioned the past, like we've talked about it. We know people that decided to get out of management, go back into being ICs and just like, focus on a specific domain. What do you think is in your future?
It's a great question. I do see a lot of interest in the security side of things. It's constantly evolving, and I just have something in me like leading edge technology and staying on top of that. But at the same time, I think that enterprise tech will really give awareness into operational efficiency. So it's more just overall operations. They put the word operations after like security or IT, what have you. But I think there's expand that into like financial applications, revenue operations, what have you. I think there's a lot of value to be unlocked and opportunities for efficiency that may not be obvious to not as technical people, the capabilities that are there.
So you still need an org, probably 300, 400, 500 people, like this isn't startup. Salesforce, I mean, people go out and buy Salesforce and then they get to a certain size and they realize they need to hire Salesforce administrators. Like you have no software, but you still have to, it's like you still have to manage it. And, the cyber, I see people go like part of it, I guess the other question is within the cyber, is it staying in the enterprise realm or is it going into the other side and the service provider realm? Because like that's a big, shift point, right?
Like managed security or
well, pick your tech, right? Do you go to a EDR vendor and do EDR deployments, or are you in a sales support role, right? Like there's lots of different opportunities in here that are still all related in this field. That's what I'm kind of curious. You go to DJing full time, right?
Yeah. I'd love to do that, but probably past that. Probably past that point. It's a great hobby though.
Yeah.
What I used to escape. Same with like the turning wrenches, right?
I guess this goes back to an earlier part, which is like the monotony, like the perceived monotony of like the job in IT. Like even with projects that you can see fulfillment on, right? Like it's not you're building a physical structure. There's no building at the end of it, right? Like I've noticed with the people going through burnout, and like what I've noticed with myself is without having like that project start stop, like these like really defined lines, what you really end up with is no defined lines, unless you're talking about like I was at this company and I moved to this other company, like that transition or lack of transition gets very weird.
It's an interesting topic because I felt like I was able to balance physical. Like you always try to convince me. It's like, why are you going to these places and doing
Hey Neil, what are you doing? I'm on a plane to Singapore tomorrow. Why are you flying to Singapore, you crazy lunatic? Yes.
I think it was a part of it where it's like it was an opportunity to get out to and get your hands dirty in that aspect. So yeah, it was my way to fulfill and keep that balance. I think personally, I have a difficult time just sticking to the keyboard stuff. But at the end of the day, it's like I think I just had to work on that balance.
I actually go to Singapore and go build out the office. Like, but my question was really always a follow up of like, okay, now you have an office in Singapore that you built out. Like, how do you support that office? On like the day 2. The day 3, day 5, day 10, these kind of, down the road, like, hey, something broke, get back on a plane, fly to New York and fix it.
Yeah. Now, a lot of that office size, how many users, and it typically falls to the MSP, right? Finding a local provider, whether what that would take or bucket hours or what have you, looks like, and creating just SOPs for whatever you need.
You have opened a lot of offices. You've closed offices. You've merged offices. WeWork changed the dynamic for a lot of companies. I'll use WeWork in terms of like just like the shared space and like the prevalence and availability and like it's culturally acceptable for you to be in one of these places. How offices open and you're going to put 10 people in an office. It feels like that's kind of like the nucleus, like somewhere like 5, 10, like maybe it's an executive that like really drives that like we need a physical presence here. How do you think shared office space like the WeWorks are going to really overlay and impact companies going through these evolutions? Is it here to stay? Does it change? Do you think companies are going to dip their toe in the water and then back out? How is it just a size thing? It has to be a nucleus of X people. Because if you need an office, you need a conference room. You need a conference room device. You need a network. You need a firewall. You need this. You need that. You need a printer. There's a lot that goes into it. You need a lease, right? Like, I'm curious what your experience has been with this.
I think it depends on obviously the size, but at the end of the day, it becomes an OpEx and CapEx question, right? If you're looking at procuring your own office space, like what state is it? We always hear it's like, oh, the space is plug and play. It's never plug and play, right? Everything from the circuit to whatever conduits and equipment, just like you mentioned, being to put in it, APs, etc. And I think that's why the model, which becomes flexible. You have to shift from an office of 50 to 100, and depending on what your lease looks like, a lot of that responsibility is pushed over. So I think it continues to exist, but I think the overall model of does this become an office where someone's sitting at it 5 days a week? It's like, probably not. We had conversations of, oh, how do we find just work that we can book for just Tuesday and Thursday? It's like, I think we're a little early into that to figure out if that model actually works, but they just start becoming collaboration spaces. So having that functionality over paired with a lot of like hotel guests. Like, sure, there's people who want to be in the office and in certain roles for full time, but I think that's what the model sells. But at the same time, the CapEx involved in that space planning and everything like that is like how much do we really want to put into this test? At least at this point.
I mean, WeWork's expensive. You look at it like dollar for dollar, it's not cheap. And now you've got another thing, which is if you're trying to maintain adherence to SOC 2 and you've got a physical security requirement coupled with a network security requirement and a device access requirement and an access point requirement, right? How much does that open up a can of worms for you if you have people going to a WeWork, getting on their network and using their access points and accessing your corporate data?
Well, I think that's why we label everything as just trust nothing. Because we want to go down that road, we're just zero trust at that point. Mm-hmm. For all I care, it could be at the office or Starbucks, and same thing.
I think that's the best thing that's happened to IT is that mentality shift of really eradicating the idea of a perimeter and like a safe spot, within, you hear enough things about like fish tanks being exploited and then like having something go out laterally. In that one, more than anything else, you just kind of throw your hands up in the air and say, what do you do? I'm trying to think what else I want to talk to you about. And we talked about SAML, we talked about SCIM, we talked about deployment, we talked about evolution of companies, BYOD. What did I miss?
One thing that has been on my mind a lot, and I'm starting to realize, like, it's almost, it seems, I don't want to say early, but I think smaller companies are still getting into it's like the no-code, low-code stuff. I only say this because the first couple years of VideoAmp, it's like I was utilizing stringing Python scripts for everything, right? But typical IT teams, they're not developers. Sure, we'll create bash scripts and things like that for wherever. But I think the no-code, low-code stuff like or Kata or what have you.
Talking about automations on these platforms to do things for you.
Right, exactly. With the ability to audit too. This nature touching what they opt that's like introduce something like has to be change control. Right. Yeah, I think I wanted to get your thoughts on it. Is why I brought it up.
I think after you've gone through any automation, like it's hard to go backwards. Like once you've seen it, you can't unwind it, right? And then it triggers this like other idea of like what else can we automate, right? And is that automation of data exchange between platforms? Like we need to get data from NetSuite to Salesforce, or from Salesforce to NetSuite, right? Why? Because we need to do revenue recognition and we need to, whatever, how, or are we running billing and invoicing out of our CRM or other platforms? Like once you go down these paths, it's really hard to unwind. We talked a lot about from like Workday managing that function of like automation, but there's other platforms and there's a lot of people. I'm seeing a lot of like Zapier consultants because everybody knows the name Zapier, right?
I was just about to say, it's like that's typically where you find an opportunity to mature the automation platform, right? It's like, why are there Zapier accounts all over the place? Like, what data are people connecting? And then they become personal accounts. When someone leaves, this breaks, and now you're hunting for these things. So I think that's what drove the conversation to let's find a platform that works for us at this stage.
And you didn't find that Zapier that gave you that, tooling.
It did for certain things. Like it was valuable for making Google Sheets and interface.
Okay.
Right. But once we wanted to do things, between a Workday and Okta or Workday Atlassian for user access reviews, all the way down to say like Snowflake to do audit polls, right? Like to your point, like when you're in the SOC teams, like it's like it becomes very repetitive to do this stuff, but you can show that this was an API call and scheduled and just does it every month. Reviewing it becomes much easier.
I'd laugh when you said Snowflake because, what's going on in the world right now looks like that every Snowflake account has been compromised, or maybe that has to be the assumption at this point. AT&T just came out and disclosed that like all call records for all customers forever, it's a third-party cloud vendor. But I mean, the value of these tools is not just like the control or the automation of the reporting, right? It's also like the creation and the skipping of steps. And I feel like the part that makes people, like the negative comes out with technology is everybody's like, oh, you're coming for my jobs. Like, no, I'm not actually coming. No, that's not what's happened. Like the argument for bringing in a service provider to do MDR for you, like, isn't because they're trying to take anybody's job out of the company. It's just because like, do you really want to receive every single alert and sit there 24/7, do correlations for every single alert that you've ever received from this platform? And that's your job. You really want that to be your job? That job sucks. Go do a better job.
I think it's similar to comparing, finding some software to use like patch management. Like, do you want to go around and then do this, or do you find a piece of software that does this for you? Right? It's the repetitive, mundane tasks that you're removing to keep the job enjoyable for people. I think is where a huge part of it comes.
Do you think that patch management is like the most derided software purchase that a company can make? I mean, it feels like it's the redheaded stepchild of like all IT purchases, patch management.
That or inventory.
Inventory, yeah. until you're like, wait, this exploit for Log4j just happened, and now we need to know every place in the planet that has Log4j running. Until like, wait a minute, everything is running Log4j. It was inventory management. I mean, some of these things, like, I don't know, maybe if some of it I'm just like jaded with stuff. It's like, oh, we're doing a layoff and you get to keep your laptop. It's like, oh yeah, you get to keep your laptop. And it's like, no, it's because it was too complicated. Somebody had a meeting where they're like, we need to bring all these laptops back and we need to wipe them and image them and redeploy them into the fleet. And it's like, here's the used laptop that somebody else had. Now you get to have it. Like, yeah, let's just keep it.
Yeah, good. Well, because then it becomes a conversation. It's like, oh, who's going to receive it back? Who's going to wipe it down? Oh, this key's broken. Now get it repaired. So it's definitely a full life cycle in its own of how you manage that successfully.
You guys even end up deploying any Chromebooks?
We did a lot of conversation around it where it's like, let's just make these disposable.
Yeah, right. I mean, your Google Workspace is kind of like it turns into this thing of like, do you just make it disposable?
Yeah, we never got into it. And I think we touched on like VDI and that stuff too. It's like, how do you handle contractors? Shipping,
international contracts.
Yeah, that, or are you in CapEx shipped to and it's even local contractors, right? Data, what are they handling?
Let's ship MacBook Pros to our contractors in Colombia. By the way, customs is going to hold these things for 4 weeks. Surprise. I'm getting signaled. It was actually a really effective signal. I mean, like so many of these things, like I was having a conversation like with a person in an unrelated industry, and it was kind of like the gist of it was avoid being yelled at. It was kind of like what their day-to-day job was like. It was like, okay, nobody wants to be the one that gets like noticed, that gets yelled at. If this breaks and I get yelled at. It's like either make sure it doesn't break or make sure I don't get yelled at when it breaks. And in that dialogue, it came a lot of like the same things like IT. When you're in IT, it's like it's too expensive when it's working. Why do we need you? It's not working. Why do we need you? Balancing those two inside of a company until you're somehow attached to revenue feels like a really bad place to be or a really tricky place to be. Now, you got yourself into a position where you accidentally got attached to revenue with a lot of projects. I mean, I was like accidentally in a bad way, right? Like it happened. As like a closing thought, like thinking back, MSP, moving into corporate IT, moving into enterprise tech, what advice would you give yourself to like attaching yourself? Like, how would you attach yourself to revenue faster? And is that the right answer? Is the right answer attaching yourself to revenue? And if so, like, how would you do it faster in the future?
Cross collaboration, understand exactly what certain departments you're using software for. And I think at first it was attributed to, oh, we'll handle authentication, like authorization to it, but you need just like you said, you need your NetSuite admin. You can still do. You need NetSuite admin, you need your Salesforce admin, what have you. But I think once the automation piece got into play, that was when the conversation started getting deeper and or to provide that value for those departments. Otherwise, to your point, like IT was just looked at as kind of like a blocker for these things. It's like, oh well, this is a revenue app. Like we don't need much help from this. Mm-hmm. So I think that's where a lot of it was driven by.
It's an interesting takeaway. Automate faster. So invest time with Zapier, get started, go to a different platform, make it easier for people to do what they need and get what they need faster.
While balancing that, you're not trying to eliminate jobs.
Of course not. Neil, thank you for doing this. Appreciate it. This is great. I obviously can talk about this stuff for hours and hours and hours. So enjoyed it.
Yeah. Pleasure.